When the power went out across Texas in February 2021, 4.5 million homes were dark within 30 hours. People burned books for heat, charged phones in idling cars, and watched their grandparents die in 70-degree drops. The lights had been on for 140 years, and one ice storm took them out. In 1380, in a village called Cotterstock in Northamptonshire, England, a peasant family lit their two-room cottage for an entire winter on a bundle of weeds and a jar of mutton fat. No electricity, no candle. They worked, mended, told stories, and slept in a home lit by a system refined over 1,200 years. The peasant used three things you can find within walking distance of your own house: a specific marsh rush called Juncus effusus, a lime-washed wall, and the fat your butcher throws away. Today we are going to walk through exactly how that system worked, why it vanished in the 1850s, and how to build a working version of it in your kitchen this weekend. The first thing to clear up is the candle. Almost every period drama, every Renaissance painting, every children's book about the Middle Ages shows a peasant family huddled around a wax candle on a wooden table. That image is false. By the late 14th century, a pound of beeswax candles cost roughly 6 to 8 pence retail in London. An unskilled rural labourer in southern England earned about 2 pence a day. A pound of beeswax candles equalled 3 to 4 days of wages, and a pound of candles burned out in 2 evenings. Beeswax candles burned in monasteries, in royal halls, in cathedrals during the Easter Vigil, and at the bedside of dying nobles. They did not burn in peasant cottages. The records confirm this. Surviving manorial account rolls from English estates and monasteries show beeswax flowing steadily to chapels and great halls, never to tenant farmers. Tallow candles, the cheaper kind cast from sheep or beef fat in a metal mould, existed by the 13th century. But tallow was not cheap either. A pound of tallow could be turned into soap, traded for grain, fed to a child during a hard winter, or rendered into cooking fat. Burning a pound of pure fat to light one evening of stitching was the kind of waste a peasant household could not afford. What is more, the tallow candle was a guild-controlled product in most English towns. The Worshipful Company of Tallow Chandlers of London received its first royal charter in 1462. Their candles were stamped, taxed and sold through licensed shops at prices the rural poor could not match. So the question of how a medieval peasant lit his home is not a question about candles at all. It is a question about a different lighting technology that has been almost completely erased from the historical record we are handed in school. That technology starts in a wet ditch. In June of 1775, an English naturalist and country parson named Gilbert White walked out to a marshy field behind his parish at Selborne in Hampshire. He bent down, cut a handful of green stalks no thicker than a pencil, and brought them back to his study. Over the next several months, he measured, weighed, and timed every step of what he had watched the local cottagers do with those stalks for the previous 40 years. His findings were published in 1789 in the Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne, Letter 26. They remain the single most precise contemporary record of medieval rushlight technology that we have. The plant was the soft rush, Juncus effusus, a perennial that grows in any damp pasture across the entire temperate world. White's cottagers gathered the rushes in midsummer when the stems were at their longest. They cut them into lengths of 15 to 30 inches. They soaked the stems in cold water for a day to keep the bark pliable. Then came the skilled part. With a fingernail or a small blade, the rush was peeled. The green outer skin was stripped away in a spiral, leaving one thin ribbon of bark running the full length of the rush as a structural backbone. Inside the bark, the pith of the rush was exposed, white, weightless, faintly translucent. The pith would become the wick. The peeled rush was hung on a string by the kitchen fire to dry for 3 to 5 days until it was light and brittle as straw. Then it was dipped through a pan of warm mutton tallow, pork fat, or kitchen grease saved through the year. The pith soaked up the fat like a wick of capillaries. One pass through the fat, lift, cool, dip again, until the pith was thoroughly coated. Gilbert White weighed the result. 1 pound of dried peeled rushes plus 6 ounces of household grease produced approximately 1,600 rushlights, each one between 15 and 28 inches long. He timed the burn. An average rushlight at 15 inches burned for about 57 minutes. Tilted at the standard 45-degree angle in an iron rushlight pincer, it gave a clean orange flame about the brightness of a modern tea light. No smoke worth speaking of. No tallow drip. The economics destroy the candle. 200 to 1. Same fat, 200 times the light. A poor cottager with a single sheep slaughtered at Martinmas could light her home for 900 hours through the winter, on the rendered fat scraps that would otherwise have been thrown to the pigs. This is what was burning when a 13th century peasant sat down to mend a tunic at dusk. Not a candle, a weed and a wick. But a rushlight on its own is 50 minutes of light from a single point. A medieval peasant cottage was not lit by one rushlight. It was lit by a system. The rushlight was only the closest layer. The centre of the system was the hearth. In a typical 14th century English longhouse, the floor plan was a single room 12 to 15 feet wide and 30 to 40 feet long, with a central hearth of beaten clay or stone slabs roughly 5 feet across. The fire on that hearth was not a temporary thing. It was lit on a feast day in autumn and kept burning, banked at night with ash, for the entire winter. Some Welsh and Highland Scottish longhouses kept their hearth fire lit continuously for years at a time, banking at night, refeeding at dawn. Pliny the Elder, writing in 77 AD, called the household fire the eternal flame of the home. The Roman Vestal fire was the public, sacred version of what every Italian peasant had quietly maintained for centuries in his own kitchen. The medieval English longhouse carried the same custom forward without naming it. A peat fire or a slow oak fire on a 5-foot hearth gives off a steady, golden, low-glare light. Modern reconstructions at the Weald and Downland Living Museum in Sussex have measured the light output at roughly 15 to 20 lumens at 3 feet from the hearth. A modern wax candle gives off about 12. The hearth was the main light source. The rushlight was the task light for close work. The third layer was the wall itself. Almost every peasant cottage in England, in France, in northern Spain, in Hungary, in Norway, had its interior walls coated in lime wash. Slaked lime mixed with water, sometimes with skim milk for binder, painted on with a broom and refreshed every few years. Lime-washed walls do two things. They are antibacterial, which is why every dairy and every root cellar in Europe was lime-washed for 2,000 years. And they reflect more than 80% of the visible light that strikes them. Modern white interior paint reflects around 75. A lime-washed wall, polished by years of use and wood smoke, reflects more light per square foot than the inside of your bedroom does right now. A single rushlight in the middle of a 15-foot lime-washed room produces measurable light at every wall. Add the hearth fire, and the room was lit. Not dim, not gloomy. The myth of the dark medieval cottage is exactly that. A myth. The fourth layer was metal. A polished brass or tin reflector placed behind a rushlight or behind a candle in a noble house could nearly double the perceived brightness of a single flame. Medieval iron and tin rushlight holders, of which hundreds survive in the collections of the Museum of London and the Victoria and Albert, often include a small brass disc set behind the pincer for exactly this reason. The same trick is used in modern industrial light fixtures today. The English peasant had soft rushes and mutton fat. A peasant in Norway, or in Highland Scotland, or in the pine forests of Pomerania did not have the same kit. He had pine. The pine knot, sometimes called fatwood or candlewood, is the resin-saturated heartwood that forms at the base of any pine branch that died on the tree before the tree itself fell. The resin in that wood, mostly turpentine and rosin, ignites at around 300 degrees Celsius and burns at a steady high temperature for 30 to 40 minutes per inch of stick. A 2-foot fatwood splint mounted on an iron sconce above the doorway of a Norwegian stave house gave roughly an hour of bright torch-grade light. Pliny mentioned pine torches in Roman Italy. The Norse sagas describe them in nearly every cottage scene. The Sami people of Lapland still gather fatwood today, and you can buy a £5 bag of it at any modern outdoor supply store for about $20. The Mediterranean version was older still. The cresset lamp, a stone or pottery bowl with a shallow oil reservoir and a floating linen wick, has been excavated from sites in Crete dating to 1500 BC. The Roman version was mass-produced in terracotta and is the lamp you see in every Pompeii museum case. The medieval version, fed by olive oil in southern Europe and by fish oil or whale oil along the Atlantic coast, lasted in some Mediterranean villages well into the 19th century. Coastal Scotland and the North Atlantic islands had a particularly grim variant. The bog candle, made from the dried body of a fulmar petrel, a seabird so oily that a single bird could be threaded with a flax wick and lit like an oversized cigar. The Faroe Islanders, the St. Kildans, and the Icelanders used these into the 1800s. And no, we are not making that up. The National Museum of Iceland has surviving fulmar candlesticks behind glass. We are not recommending the fulmar candle as a modern protocol. Every region developed its own lighting kit out of whatever local fat or resin was free. There was never just one medieval lighting system, there were 40. The common thread was that the light source was always made by the household from materials gathered in summer with skills passed mother to daughter. If this investigation is opening your eyes, subscribe. Every week, Medieval Way digs up another piece of the operating system our ancestors ran on, the kind of knowledge that turns a power outage into an inconvenience instead of an emergency. You can begin rebuilding the system this weekend. 6 steps. Each one has been done in every century for the last 2,000 years. None of them require electricity, a hardware store, or more than $10 of materials. 1. Find your rushes. Soft rush, Juncus effusus, grows in any damp ditch, wet field, or pond margin in every temperate region of the world. It is the tall, smooth, dark green plant that grows in clumps 3 feet high, with no leaves and a small brown flower head 2/3 of the way up the stalk. Identify it by the smooth, unbranched stem and the spongy white pith that shows when you snap one open. Cut 20 stems in midsummer when they are at their longest. Trim them to 15 inches each. 2. Soak the rushes for 24 hours in a bowl of cold water. The bark needs to stay flexible while you peel it. If your rushes have already dried for weeks, soak them for 48 hours. 3. Peel them. Hold the rush by one end. Using your thumbnail, run a strip of bark away from the body of the rush, leaving one thin ribbon of green bark running the entire length to support the pith. If the pith breaks under your fingernail, you peel too aggressively. Start over. If you cannot strip without breaking the pith, your rushes are too dry. Soak them longer. This step takes practice. Plan on losing the first 5 rushes. 4. Dry the peeled rushes for 3 to 5 days, hanging from a string in a warm, dry spot. They are ready when they are stiff, brittle, and the colour of pale straw. If they are still flexible, dry them longer. If they smell musty or have visible mould on them, Throw them out and start again. 5. Render your fat. Save kitchen grease for a month. Bacon fat, beef trimmings, the fat off a roast chicken. Pour the accumulated fat into a small saucepan over low heat and warm it until it is just liquid between 60 and 70 degrees Celsius. Do not let it smoke. Skim any solids off the top with a slotted spoon. 6. Dip the rushes. Hold each rush by the unwicked end, drag it slowly through the warm fat, lift it out, let the excess drip back into the pan for 10 seconds, then lay the rush on a sheet of parchment to cool. Repeat the dip 3 times for a heavily coated rush, once for a quick light. A 15-inch rush coated 3 times will burn for roughly 50 minutes. Tilt your finished rush light at a 45-degree angle in any non-flammable holder. Improvise. A cast-iron Dutch oven lid, a notched cork wedged into a glass jar, or a pair of household pliers braced against a brick will all work. The first rushlight you light will smell like bacon. The second one will smell less. By the time you have made a batch of 50, your hands will know the work, your kitchen will smell faintly like a 14th century cottage, and you will have lit your home for an entire winter on materials that cost you nothing but your own attention. Fat is cheap. Your independence is not. When the power went out across Texas in February 2021, 4.5 million homes were dark inside of 30 hours. The peasant in Cotterstock had a rushlight in her hand within 30 seconds of dusk. The grid did not fail her because she was never on it. This is not a sales pitch for the harder life. The medieval peasant worked longer hours than you do, ate worse food in the lean months, and watched her children die of diseases your antibiotics would clear in a week. Medieval lighting is a parallel skill, not a wholesale return. We let it go in 2 generations because the new option arrived easier and brighter, and the old one had no defender. The rushes are still growing in the ditch, the fat is still in your pan, the walls are still ready to be lime-washed. Subscribe to Medieval Way, drop a comment, and tell us the longest power outage you have ever lived through. Make a rushlight this weekend, and the next outage will be a quieter night instead of an emergency. Let's keep digging up what they buried.